Since 1986, with the first game releasing on the Nintendo Entertainment System, Zelda has been a critically acclaimed franchise, with 29 different video games released, including original titles, ports, remakes, and collections. This franchise has left its mark on the gaming world in amazing ways. In 2016, Nintendo rocked the world with the release of Breath of the Wild, an amazing game that spearheaded the initial sales of the Switch console. In 2023, can they do it again with the release of their newest title, Tears of the Kingdom? My name is Llamas, and this is the spoiler-filled review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. In this review, I will be going into great detail about everything in this video game, my score for the game, and my reasons why. This review will be full of spoilers, going into depth on the story, characters, dungeons, and everything else in the game. There is a spoiler-free version of this video, linked down in the description below. This is your last warning to click off before spoilers start. Let's get into the review. There are many portions of this game that I would like to talk about in detail, but they all come together in two main categories. The world, which will include, the new world, your tools, the dungeons, shrines, graphics, gameplay, essentially everything that you can interact with in Hyrule. And two, the story. This will include the main story, side quests, cutscenes, and essentially anything that has to do with the story aspect of the game. In each category and subcategories, I will go into great detail about what I liked and what I didn't like about the game. By the end, I hope that it is clear why I gave it the score I did, so sit back, relax, open something on your other monitor to watch, and enjoy. The world. There is something miraculous about a game developer when they can take a pre-existing world and change it into something completely new. Before even playing the game, I had my worries and doubts about the world. It would be the exact same thing, and this would be a $70 DLC. I was then pleased to see that it was far from the reality. There are three sections to the overworld that I want to talk about. So, let's talk about the main section and the largest. Hyrule is completely different in this game compared to its older brother, Breath of the Wild. Many aspects of the world are echoes of its former self, but with an identity solely belonging to the new game. Going through and exploring many of these areas that were in Breath of the Wild are completely changed in most cases. Many of the familiar places that you will find are changed in many ways, or they have many new quests available for you to complete. The monsters that you will face throughout the world do suffer from the same problems they had in Breath of the Wild. There aren't really that many. They did add a few new types of monsters that will stand in your way throughout the game, but not enough to make it feel like you aren't just attacking the same mob every other time. For the mobs they removed, they essentially put a one-for-one replacement for them in the game. For example, the Guardians and the Hand mobs in the game. Speaking of Guardians, they aren't in the game anymore, and all of those items aren't in the game. Instead, they are replaced by the new Zonite weapons and items. I personally think these are a lot cooler than the former. Shrines throughout the world work essentially the same, with a few varying on how you get them. The towers now serve another purpose than just exploring the map. They serve as a tool to reach the sky portion of the map. In the end, it is still the same Hyrule that you know and loved from the previous game. I must give credit where credit is due, and say that what they did with the new version of the map is much more intuitive and more fun to explore than the previous game in my experience. The overworld is something to marvel at, but there are two other sections. The Sky Islands are a familiar sight to see to those who have played some older Zelda games. They are similar to that of Skyward Sword. Many don't have much on them or much to do, but there are a few key islands that you will have to visit throughout your playthrough. Overall, these islands were about what I expected. They add to the game, but not very much outside of the dungeons that are up in a few of them. On some of the special islands, there's a gravity mechanic that is very fun, and I enjoyed my time exploring those islands. At the time of writing, there are many that I still haven't explored and puzzles I need to uncover, but I still feel like I can talk about these. Without the Sky Islands, there would be a void left in this game, and they almost feel like they should have been in there in the first game with the gliding mechanics and everything you already did in the sky. The amount of verticality that was added to the game was astounding at first glance, but Nintendo added even more. Diving deep into the earth of Hyrule, players will find a vast cavern, dark and full of gloom. At first glance, this zone is massive, spreading underneath the entire map with many points of entry. In the depths, it has its own version of shrines, light routes. These points allow fast travel and show a small portion of the depths around them, and also serve as a point to dispel gloom that you have accumulated. They do not have an inside like the shrines. They are just there for those purposes. This zone is full of monsters, bases, and loot that was beautifully hidden from the player to find. There are many collectibles down here, which is a nice addition to the game. Many points of the story also have you explore down in the depths, including 2 dungeons. Many portions of the ground and walls are covered in gloom, which will have you making vehicles to pass over them to collect everything. The depths was a surprise to me before getting the game. I expected the Sky Islands, but I had no clue about the depths. Between the 3 zones, Tears of the Kingdom provides more variety in where you can play the game than ever before, crushing that of even Breath of the Wild, the previous biggest game in the franchise. There's almost too much to explore and collect in this version of Hyrule. If you are a collectionist, this game is definitely for you, with hundreds of hours of searching the smallest caves to find everything to hit 100% completion. For those of just wanting a vast world to explore and have a good time, it also serves very well for you. As I said before, it is one of my favorite maps in all of gaming just to explore and have fun. Nintendo really outdid themselves with the design and function of the world this time around. And to explore the world around you, they gave you new abilities. In Breath of the Wild, you received a tablet that gave you many abilities, including bombs, stasis, and a magnet. This game is very similar, but the abilities you got are way better. You get the ability to rewind time on objects, lift almost any object instead of just metal ones, combine items onto your weapon, shield, and arrows, the ability to go through the ceiling, and the ability to stick together objects and create schematics for vehicles that you have made. The versatility of these abilities dwarfs that of the previous abilities Link could use. Thinking back, I don't know how I would be able to play the previous game without these, since they are so useful. Nintendo also designed the world around these abilities well. In the previous title, everything was designed to where you could get anywhere using those abilities. Changing them means they had to change the whole world too. They did an amazing job doing this, and you get used to using the new abilities compared to the old ones. I think Nintendo knocked it out of the park with these new abilities, and it makes the game way more fun in my opinion. Now let's get into the dungeons. Dungeons have been a big staple in the Zelda franchise since the very first game released in 1986. Most of the time, these dungeons were themed and set up in specific ways to defeat them. You found a hidden item, and you used it to defeat a mini-boss and then a final boss in the dungeon to get your heart piece and move along with the story. Breath of the Wild was a sudden stop to this sort of style of dungeon. You didn't get any items that were designed to beat a boss, and there weren't any mini-bosses really either. They still had a slight theme, but nothing near the themes of dungeons in previous titles. Tears of the Kingdom improved on the ideas that Breath of the Wild left behind. There is still no item you acquire, but there is something that is provided for you that you must utilize in each dungeon to complete. In this game, you are given companions that help you with their abilities throughout the dungeon. You use their skills to complete the puzzles and use them on the final boss. In some ways, this is much more similar to the original games compared to Breath of the Wild, but still keeps that similar style of Breath of the Wild. Let's talk about each dungeon individually. I completed the dungeons in this order: wind, fire, lightning, water, spirit. So I will talk about them in that order. The wind dungeon was really fun and really inventive. This is the first dungeon that the game pushes you to do. Many of the characters hint that you're supposed to go over here, and the reason is why is very clear. The companion you get is really good at traversing the world and makes everything way easier. The puzzle of the dungeon begins before you even set foot into it. Getting to the dungeon is half the battle. The sequence of getting to this dungeon was my favorite out of all of them, and the world around you was incredibly cool the entire way through. The use of new vehicles to move around with the ability to move faster through the air with your companion made for a fun combination of movement and ways you could approach this dungeon. Getting to the dungeon, you are told that there is a mechanism that you have to turn on to open the door to the final boss. This is essentially the master key from previous titles, and you will have to utilize the abilities of your companion. This made for a refreshing approach to how you complete the dungeon. I would have preferred that they didn't tell you where everything was on your map, or at least made you find a map or a compass to show you where everything was instead. I felt like this made the dungeon way easier than it could have been, but I understand that it has to be completed by all ages. There were many puzzles that required thinking outside of the box or a clever use of a new ability that you recently acquired. After completing everything, this final boss is one of the most unique bosses in Zelda. To defeat it, you never really attack it in the normal sense. You are supposed to dive through the boss and damage it that way, with the new dive movement abilities. The movement and style of boss was really cool, and it felt like nothing that I have seen before, but reminds me a little bit of the water temple boss in Twilight Princess. This first dungeon had to be my favorite and set a bar for the following dungeons to come. Moving on to the fire dungeon, getting there had few really cool events. One where you basically get to fly an airplane to kill all your enemies. The ability that your companion has is underwhelming after using the wind companion for some time at this point, but it has its uses. The surprise I had here was that you had to dive to the depths to find the dungeon. This added a whole new level to the dungeon that I didn't think was possible, when you are in the depths and there is gloom to stand in your way. This was the longest and most complicated dungeon in the game, and also the one I feel I cheesed the hardest. Making it so you can climb anywhere in the dungeon compared to Breath of the Wild made this dungeon rather easy, since I could just climb and jump to places instead of using the cart mechanics that were designed for this dungeon. This dungeon had the same way to get to the bosses, all the others. Use your companion ability to hit 4 things to open the door to the final boss. At first, this was a cool idea, but I wish they did try something different for all the dungeons. The style and atmosphere of this dungeon was spot on, just like the Wind Dungeon. Being in the depths added something to it that just isn't the same to many fire dungeons before. The final boss of this dungeon had to be my least favorite and was extremely underwhelming compared to the Wind Temple. So far, Wind is best, Fire is worst. The Lightning Temple introduces a new mechanic for you to use throughout your journey in Hyrule. The lightning ability given to you by your new companion is a powerful long-range attack that can be utilized anywhere. But the time it takes to charge up is really annoying and makes me not want to use it in normal battle. The more companions you get, the more you notice their abilities suck to activate, except for Tulin, the Wind Companion. You have to talk to them to activate it, and that's not really fun in the middle of battle where everyone is running around trying to hit things. Back to the dungeon. This one introduced light mechanics similar to previous Zelda titles. This dungeon had some interesting puzzles that made me scratch my head for a bit until I figured them out. This was a sigh of relief that I couldn't cheese anything in here like the fire dungeon. In this dungeon, you actually had to really manage your companion to get them throughout the dungeon to hit pylons in order to activate the doors. Kind of like back in Wind Waker when you had to really manage your companions. This was the next level that I needed after doing the previous 2 dungeons, and I was happy to see it wasn't in the other ones after. The boss in the Lightning Dungeon was the hardest one out of all of them, but just like Breath of the Wild, if done correctly, it could have been a lot easier, but I made it a lot harder on myself to have more fun. Ranking them now, Wind, Lightning, Fire. The Water Dungeon was a bit different because it had the most amount of quests to get into the dungeon, including many riddles and talking to NPCs for hints on where to go out throughout the zone. On every step of getting in, you had to figure something out, as well as completing a mini dungeon to get into the main one. This dungeon was all about cleansing the water in the zone. So your ability is a water shield that shoots water out to cleanse things in your path. Again, you have to talk to the companion to activate it, which is very annoying. It should just happen when you use your shield. The dungeon was in a low gravity zone, which saved an otherwise boring dungeon. This new mechanic changed the way you would think about puzzles, as well as how you fought, since dodging was a punishment in most cases, and you could just fly off the dungeon. This boss was really underwhelming again, but I cheesed it and used items instead of using the ability to make it easier. The rank is now Wind, Lightning, Water, Fire. The final dungeon was a complete surprise to me and many people playing this game. Breath of the Wild only had 4 dungeons for you to complete. This one was a surprise at the end, when you thought you should be facing off against Ganon. This dungeon, also in the depths and known as the Spirit Dungeon, is a huge dungeon where you have many light routes to light the zone around you. The puzzle here is collecting pieces of a mecha to give to the Spirit Guardian. The puzzle here is collecting pieces of a mecha to give the Spirit Guardian a body. Getting to the parts was really easy. Getting back, you had to solve clever puzzles and then use vehicles to transport the pieces back. This dungeon is also different because you don't get the companion until you essentially finish the puzzles of the dungeon. This companion is both hilarious and very useful. She is a mecha that you get to ride on and attach stuff to. Amazing, Nintendo. The boss fight is also equally as funny and fun. It's a mecha battle, one of the best dungeon final bosses I have faced, and it wasn't even a hard fight at all. My final verdict on the order of dungeons is Wind, Spirit, Lightning, Water, Fire. Overall, the dungeons were much better than Breath of the Wild and are comparable to Zelda dungeons in previous titles. The different ways they are designed and that you have to complete them was interesting, but I wish there were a bit more varied on how you get into the final boss room, and I wish they didn't tell you where everything was and you had to explore for yourself. The pre-dungeon portions were all varied and were really fun to complete, sometimes more fun than the actual dungeon you were trying to get to. These dungeons were great and added a lot to my enjoyment of the game. If you were upset with Breath of the Wild dungeons, then you will enjoy these more, I'm sure. The final Ganon fight. This fight was one of the best fights in the entire franchise, with multiple phases, all with different mechanics and ways to defeat the boss. It was refreshing after facing many of the same mobs over and over again. I was also happy to see that the Guardians did not fight with you the entire time. They were absent on the way to the boss, just like the dungeons, it had a very long sequence that you had to do to get to the boss. They also showed up to help with waves of enemies. Then they came in after a phase or two during the final fight. The final sequence puts Breath of the Wilds to shame. Riding the dragons and doing air combat on that grand scale was a sight to see, and was way more enjoyable than the ground fight in the first game, in my opinion. The final scene was very satisfying, and I was left very happy afterwards. Shrines. With the dungeons out of the way, let's talk about shrines. There are way more shrines in this version of Hyrule, and I would argue they are way more fun and interesting. The abilities you are given to complete these shrines have way more uses than Breath of the Wild. Many of the shrines had so many ways you could complete them, and the challenge shrines were way harder than just doing a 1v1 with a mini guardian from the previous titles. With more shrines in the game, there are more time needed to find all of them and collect everything. If you liked Breath of the Wild's shrines, you will love these ones, guaranteed. Graphics and gameplay. Now that we have gotten most of what you will do in the game and see out of the way, let's talk about how you will see them and interact with them in graphics and gameplay. If you don't like cel-shaded graphics, you will not like this game. I personally love the graphics and think they are masters of using this art style. The way they are able to show texture, light, and colors through this art style is a feat in itself. Although in the Sky Islands, the lighting is a bit out of whack, everything looks great, in cutscenes and out. Unlike Cyberpunk I played right before this game, this all doesn't mean anything to you if you just don't like the art style, which I know many people do not. Also, if you are looking for a realistic graphics running at 4K 60 FPS, you are playing the wrong game. This game doesn't run that well, even though it is cel-shaded. The Switch is just a weak console. It is underpowered when it was released 6 years ago in 2017, and by today's standards, it just can't stand up to the big competitors. Nintendo knows this, and did an amazing job getting this game to run almost smoothly wherever on the map. I get the frame drops here and there, especially while building things, and at a few points on the map. This doesn't get in my way of combat or moving around the world. Many people have complained that they can't play the game at this frame rate, and I have to agree with them sometimes. I prefer to have a really high frame rate, and when things are moving around on your screen or you're panning around, it isn't the best to look at, especially when you hit those frame drops. It hurts gameplay quite a lot. It's too bad that this game is locked behind the Switch's hardware, because besides that, it's truly an amazing game. The game is also essentially glitch and bug free to the point that when you find one, it almost feels like an intended feature. I never had to reset my game never crashed, and I never had any weird anomalies happen in the game that really caught my eye. I had to go out of my way to look up some of them to see them in action, and Nintendo patched most of them up within the first month. It won't be like other games like Cyberpunk, where I couldn't go 10 minutes playing without seeing a bug or glitch. Speaking of gameplay, let's talk about the kind of gameplay you'll be doing throughout the game. Combat in this game is just like Breath of the Wild. If you were good at that, you'll be good at this game. They changed almost nothing between the two titles, besides a few things here and there. The dodging feels good, the flurry rush and perfect blocks fighting opponents feels good when you hit them. The time slow effect when you use your bow in the air is always useful, and the aiming and motion controls is the second best thing compared to using a mouse and keyboard. The gameplay is diverse enough to where I didn't get bored fighting anything throughout the game because of it. If you enjoy sword gameplay like Dark Souls or Elder Scrolls or whatever, or you like the previous game, you will enjoy this gameplay. Final thoughts on the world. The world of Hyrule has never really felt this good. Breath of the Wild destroyed the open world genre with its amazing style, gameplay, and design. Tears of the Kingdom did it again. I would say that the design of the world is superior. Taking another 6 years to work on the same world has to make it better, right? The style of this world I am in love with, and it just shits on most other open world games made today. Creating a world with almost zero bugs and glitches is amazing. But considering that you can create almost anything in this game and interact with things in a near infinite way and it still works is just mind-blowing. Nintendo really took their time and made something truly beautiful, and I would just love it if everyone was able to experience it the way I have. Let's talk about the story. Moving on from the world, let's talk about the story of this game. When Breath of the Wild released, many people were not satisfied with the story that it brought to the table. The voice acting was strange, you had to go look for the story, and it wasn't very much of it. I think Tears of the Kingdom has many of the same faults as Breath of the Wild, but they improved on everything compared to the previous game. Overall, the story is better, 100%. Something happened 1,000 years ago that has haunted Hyrule ever since. The king at the time and his 6 sages fought the Demon King and almost lost. He managed to sacrifice himself and seal away the Demon King, but only temporarily. With time travel shenanigans, Zelda is transported back in time and sets everything on a path for Link to be able to defeat Ganon in the future. You have several pieces of the puzzle of her past to figure out what happened and what she needs you to do in order to defeat this monster that was unkillable before. Link has to go through collect the stones that granted the power to the stages long ago, and raise the new champions of this new era to fight Ganon. I could get way more into the story than that, but that is the general gist. And the story is much more enjoyable than Breath of the Wild, in my opinion. Instead of remembering everything we had forgotten, we were piecing together stories from a long time ago to figure out what Zelda was doing to help us. The new champions were more interesting than the divine beasts of the old game, and added way more to the story when you were able to talk to them and interact with them since they weren't dead. This game also has the advantage of having a previous game's lore to help out with. Breath of the Wild had to do everything from near scratch, while this game had something to build off of. Most of the story about Zelda is given through cutscenes, very similar to the memories of Breath of the Wild, and are found throughout Hyrule in geoglyphs. My one gripe about the geoglyphs was that there was a specific order you had to have them done in, but there is no way to know outside of looking them up. I happened to watch cutscene 15 as my third one, and it spoiled some major deaths in the story that hadn't happened yet. In the grand scheme of things, this wasn't that big of a deal, but it was rather annoying at the time. Talking more about the cutscenes, they were much better than Breath of the Wild's. They had more things happening during them, the voice acting was much better, and everything fit together nicer as well. The ending of this game was very satisfying. If you are paying attention, it was very easy to see where the story was going and how it was going to end, but it was still fun and interesting to see whenever you reached it. In the end, I think the story was much better and stronger than the previous game in the series. I think it even rivals that of previous Zelda titles, where the linear story was given in the correct order and pace that the devs wanted. Side quests. This game's not only main quests. This game not only boasts a good length main storyline, but also almost doubles the amount of side quests as the first Zelda Breath of the Wild. The quests vary a lot, having you collect things to difficult puzzles, to quests that rival the size of the main story quest lines. Along with the completionism and everything that you can collect, there is too much to do in this game for someone to complete in a reasonable amount of time. If you are looking to spread your money as far as possible for a new game, this one will last you as long as you need it to and more. Final thoughts. There are a few games out there that truly grab your attention and time as well as this game does. Sitting for hours and hours grinding away on something this game has to offer feels like no other. Any game that I can play for 8 hours straight and it only feels like 2 is a great game to me. The sheer amount of things you can do in this game and the amount of time that you can spend to your heart's content is not enough unless it is also fun to play while doing it. This game delivers on that. You will have fun. From creating anything you can think of with the tools at your disposal, to navigating to fighting strong enemies, the game nearly has it all. The game could, of course, be better than it is. There are a few downgrades from Breath of the Wild to this game, including the companion powers that you receive, but there are way more upgrades. This game has some of my favorite fights out of any Zelda game I have played, as well as a few of my new favorite mechanics as well. If you have a Switch, I would recommend buying this game. You will get your $70 out of it, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. Of course, there is way more I could talk about in this game, from going in depth even more on so many things, but my final score for this game is a 91 out of 100. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. And if you still want to see that spoiler-free review, it's down in the description below.